everyone. For the next 2 class periods, we will be working on covering Module 14, which is on the respiratory system. So here's a figure of the respiratory system. And typically we divide the respiratory system into the upper respiratory system and the lower respiratory system. So the structures, the anatomical structures that make up the upper respiratory system are the nasal cavity, so the nose, and the nasal sinuses, and then the pharynx. The lower respiratory system then begins with the larynx or the voice box. And then it includes the trachea and the bronchial tubes. And let's just say the bronchi. And then, out there, bronchi, there should be an N in there. The bronchi, and then the lungs. Okay, you can see those different parts. So here's the pharynx. So the nasal cavity obviously up here, and the sinuses that surround that, and then the pharynx would mark the end of the upper respiratory system. The pharynx actually helps to close off. So it's this low, it's a structure right here, and it actually helps to close off the nasal cavity when you're swallowing, so that the food, in the same way that the epiglottis does, it helps to ensure that the food goes down the esophagus and not down the trachea, because the pharynx closes that off when you swallow. The other thing that's in this area around the pharynx are the eustachian tubes. And the eustachian tubes have openings in them that allow air to move between the middle ear and the pharynx, and that helps to make sure that the pressure stays equal between the atmosphere and the inner ear. And you've probably all experienced that unequal pressure when you go up a mountain or in an airplane. When the atmospheric pressure is greater than the pressure in the inner ear, then you get that pain. Well, the openings to the eustachian tube, which is near this, near the pharynx, help to make sure that that pressure stays equal. The larynx you probably know as your voice box, and air moving across the larynx from the respiratory system is what produces sound. If we look at the trachea, so trachea sometimes is called our windpipe, it actually consists of 20 pieces of cartilage. It doesn't look like you can see all of them there, or you couldn't count them, but the trachea is made up of 20 pieces of cartilage. And then the trachea divides into the left and right bronchi. So this would be the right, this would be the left. Okay, so it divides into right and left bronchi, and then those further divide, into more branches, and each of those branches terminates in a structure that is called an alveolus, and that's shown in this insert up here. So the plural is alveoli, singular is an alveolus, but so the bronchi branch into these alveoli, and it's actually at the alveoli where gas exchange happens. In other words, that's where oxygen gets picked up by the blood and carbon dioxide gets dropped off, and so that it can be eliminated from the body. The other thing I want you to notice about the lungs is that if we look at the right lung consists of 3 lobes. So there's 1, 2, 3 lobes in the right lung. If you look at the left lung, it only has 2 lobes, 1, 2. And the reason for that is because your heart is not placed right in the middle of your chest. It sits more to the left side, and so there's not as much room on the left side, so the left lung only has 2 lobes instead of the 3 lobes that we see on the right side. So the other thing that I want to really emphasize is these alveoli, because this at the alveoli is where oxygen and CO2, carbon dioxide, get exchanged between the alveoli and the blood. So oxygen goes into the blood at the alveoli, and carbon dioxide goes from the blood into the alveoli, so that it can then be exhaled. So I'm going to go ahead and write that out, because that's a really important point of the respiratory system. So at the alveoli, oxygen diffuses into the blood, and then obviously that oxygen can then be transported throughout the body. And also at the alveoli, carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli, so it's going the other direction. So that it can be exhaled and eliminated from the body. Okay, so we just have the exact opposite movement. Oxygen moves from the alveoli into the blood. Carbon dioxide moves from the blood into the alveoli, so that it can then be eliminated, exhaled and eliminated from the body as waste. When oxygenated blood, so once this blood is oxygenated, then it, as we learn with cardiovascular, it leaves the lungs, it goes to the heart, and then the heart pumps it to the body tissues. And so then the oxygen gets delivered to the body tissues, and then at the body tissues, carbon dioxide gets carbon dioxide moves into the blood, and it then gets transported back to the lungs. And then, as we said earlier, at the lungs, then it moves into the alveoli, and then it can be exhaled from the body. So oxygen and carbon dioxide get exchanged between the blood and the cells, and that's really one of the main jobs, the main job really of the respiratory system. And the respiratory system does it performs other functions, like our sense of smell comes from the respiratory system. The respiratory system also, is involved in producing sound or producing voice, but really its one of the most important functions of the respiratory system is that exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the lungs, and particularly between the blood and the alveoli. Let's look at a figure of how breathing happens. Okay, so this figure from your textbook is going to show the main muscles of inspiration or breathing in. So when you breathe in, the main muscles that are involved in that are the diaphragm, and then also the external intercostals. So breathing in happens because these muscles contract, and then when you exhale, that happens because these same muscles relax. So this is just kind of normal everyday breathing in and breathing out. If you're exercising or taking a deep breath, then other muscles get involved, like the sternocleidomastoid, the pectoralis minor gets involved for taking a deep breath in, or if you are doing a forced exhale, like trying to force out as much air from your lungs as you can, then the abdominal muscles get involved. But in terms of just everyday, normal breathing in and out at rest, is going to primarily be the diaphragm and the external intercostals. So, as you know, the diaphragm is this big sheet of muscle that divides the chest cavity from the abdominal cavity. So chest cavity here, abdominal cavity here, and this big sheet of muscle that separates those is the diaphragm. So when you inhale, what happens is that the diaphragm contracts, and that means it shortens and it pulls downward. So when it pulls downward, so the diaphragm contracting, it pushes on your abdominal organs. And what that does is it causes the thoracic cavity to increase. So it pushes on the abdominal organs, and that increases the size of the thoracic cavity or the chest cavity. So if you increase the size of the thoracic cavity, then lungs expand and air rushes in. So lungs expand and air rushes in. So all that happens when that's how we breathe in, is because of the contraction of the diaphragm. So diaphragm contracts, that pushes on the abdominal organs that are below it. That what that does is that increases the size of this cavity here. And if you increase the size of this cavity, that means the lungs can expand, and as those lungs expand, then air is going to rush in to fill the lungs, and that's what inspiration is. The external intercostals do a similar thing in that they what they do is they kind of pull the ribs out, and when you pull the ribs out, the result is the same. You're going to increase the size of this cavity. That means the lungs can expand, and then air will rush into those expanded lungs. When you exhale, all that happens is that those same muscles relax. So the diaphragm and the external intercostals relax. And when they relax, then the size of this cavity decreases. And so then the lungs, when the size of this cavity decreases, then the lungs get kind of pushed in, and so the air moves out of them. So the same muscles are involved. Breathing in is when the muscles are contracting, and when the muscles relax, then that's when you exhale and the air moves out of the lungs. If you are going to do a forced exhaling, so if you're going to push out as much of the air in your lungs that you can, then you'll contract your abdominal muscles more, and that when those abdominal muscles, it pushes the abdominal muscles against the diaphragm, and that kind of reduces the thoracic cavity even more. So that then when you reduce the size of the thoracic cavity, that kind of pushes on the lungs, and you can force even more air out of it. So those of you who have had chemistry have learned about Boyle's law. And what Boyle's law says, it's Boyle's gas law, and it says that if you decrease volume, you increase pressure. And vice versa, if you increase volume, you decrease pressure. So in other words, we would say that pressure and volume are inversely proportional to each other. When you increase one, the other one decreases. When you decrease one, the other one increases. So how does that relate to breathing? Well, when the thoracic cavity is smaller, then that means, so smaller thoracic cavity, that means there's less volume in the lungs. So with less volume in the lungs, that's going to increase the pressure in the lungs. So if you increase the pressure in the lungs, then that means the pressure in the lungs is greater than the pressure in the atmosphere, and so the air will move out of the lungs. So you will exhale. Okay, and then conversely, if you increase the size of the thoracic cavity, so if you increase the size of the thoracic cavity, that means that's going to increase the volume in the lungs. If the volume is increased, that means the pressure is going to decrease, so it's going to be decreased pressure in the lungs. If there's decreased pressure in the lungs, that means that the atmospheric pressure, the pressure in the atmosphere, so the atmospheric pressure is greater than the lung pressure, and air will move from a high pressure area to a low pressure area, so that means air is going to move into the lungs. Okay, so the size of the thoracic cavity determines the volume that is in the lungs, and then we apply Boyle's law. If you increase the volume in the lungs, you're going to decrease the pressure. When you decrease the pressure in the lungs, then the pressure in the atmosphere is going to be greater than that. So what will happen? Air will move from the atmosphere into the lungs, and then so that is inhaling. Okay, and then as we saw, the exact opposite happens when you exhale. And all of this comes about by the contraction of the diaphragm for inhaling. So when you inhale, this is all set in motion by the contraction of the diaphragm. And then exhaling, where we saw the opposite, where you decrease the thoracic cavity, that all occurs just by the relaxation of the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. The other thing I'll mention just briefly, so really Boyle's law and the contraction or relaxation of the diaphragm and the atmosphere and the external intercostals dictate air moving into or out of the lungs. The other thing that really helps with ventilation and is that the lungs have elastic fibers in them. And those elastic fibers allow the lungs to stretch so that they can stretch, but then it can also return to their smaller size, and obviously that's going to help with ventilation. In individuals who have a condition that's called emphysema, maybe you've heard of that. Emphysema is a condition in which the these elastic fibers degenerate, and often they're just replaced by scar tissue. So the people especially have trouble exhaling and getting air out of their lungs so that they can then inhale. So emphysema really affects the ability of the lungs to stretch and return to their smaller size because of the deterioration of those elastic fibers. Okay, I want to look in more detail now at the alveoli. Okay, so this figure is showing the place where the alveoli and the red blood cells. Remember, erythrocyte is a red blood cell. So it's showing where the alveoli, which is shown in blue, and the erythrocytes, the red blood cells, come together. So as you'll see here, we're going to have oxygen and carbon dioxide, moving between the blood and the alveoli. The alveoli are lined with simple squamous epithelial tissue. And I know that's been a long time since we did tissue, but you might remember that the simple squamous epithelial tissue is kind of flat and it's very, very thin. It's also moist, and in fact, a lot of it's in this area is made of water. And the fact that it's made of simple epithelial tissue allows the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide to occur because it doesn't have to go through several layers of tissue. It just has to go through a very thin layer of tissue. Remember, I also said that it is there's a lot of water in this area, and you may remember from chemistry or even from biology that water molecules like to stick together, and we call that surface tension. So water molecules are attracted to each other and they like to stay together. So when the alveoli fill up with air, that kind of forces these water molecules to have to move away from each other, but they don't want to move away from each other. But as long as there's enough force, with like inspiration, for example, the alveoli will expand, but as soon as you decrease that force, the surface tension on the water will bring those the alveoli back together, and so that also helps with exhaling or expiration. Okay, so let me say that again. So water molecules like to stay together, and that's really, it's due to their hydrogen bonds, but we call that surface tension. And because there's this fluid in here, when the alveoli inflate with air, that pressure is enough to force the water molecules apart so that you can inhale, but they don't want to move apart because of this surface tension. So as soon as you decrease the force, then the surface tension on the water will pull the water molecules back together, and that kind of pulls the alveoli back so that it closes up, and that helps with the exhaling or the expiration. Okay, this figure is showing that the lungs, so the pink part in the center there are the lungs, and you can see the 3 lobes of the lungs on the right side, so 1, 2, 3, and then just the 2 lobes of the lung on the left side. But then I want to point out that there are 2 membranes that are associated with the lungs. One of those membranes is called the visceral pleura. So the visceral pleura is a membrane that goes around the lungs. Okay, so I'm kind of outlining it here. And then the parietal pleura actually kind of lines the like the diaphragm or the chest wall. So where the lungs actually fit into the chest wall, there is another membrane. Okay. So the area between those 2 membranes, so here's the membrane that surrounds the lungs, here's the membrane that lines the chest cavity. So the area in between those 2 is called the pleural cavity, and the term pleural refers to the lungs. This pleural cavity is filled with fluid, and there's no air in there. So the pleural cavity is filled with fluid, no air. So that when the lungs are inflating, that actually kind of creates like a negative pleural pressure in here, or like a vacuum, because the pressure in here is lower than the atmospheric pressure. So that the lungs kind of create a suction to keep the lungs open, to keep them from collapsing. And then at the same time, there's a negative pressure from the ribs that actually keeps the lungs from closing. So these opposite pressures actually keep the lungs from collapsing completely, so that they will stay inflated. So that's important because there's this seal that exists between these 2 membranes. If you break this seal that exists between those 2 membranes, then air will go rushing in, and then the pressure inside here will be the same as the atmospheric pressure, and it's that pressure difference between the atmospheric pressure and the lung pressure that keeps the lungs open, or keeps them from collapsing on each other. So if you break this seal, then what you'll get a collapsed lung. So and that is referred to as a pneumothorax. What happens when the seal gets broken, and the atmospheric pressure and the pressure in here are the same, so the lung doesn't stay inflated. The good thing is that if each of the lungs has its own membranes around it, so if one of the lungs collapses, you can still breathe with the other lung while the other one heals, or it can get inflated until it can get reinflated medically. So in order to breathe properly, we have to be able to have this seal between the pleura that covers the lungs itself and the pleura that line the chest cavity. You have perhaps heard of a substance that is called surfactant. Surfactant is a substance that is in the lungs, and it's really kind of like it basically acts like a detergent. It has an end that likes to get close to the water, and it has an end that kind of tries to stay away from the water. So if you remember studying the cell membrane, like the plasma membrane in a cell, and we said that it has like these tails that don't like the water. So these ends like the water. These ends are hydrophobic. They don't like the water. Hydrophobic. So what happens with this detergent is that it keeps the water molecules from it keeps the water molecules from or it maintains the water molecules together, and that reduces the surface tension so that the alveoli can inflate more easily. One of the problems with premature babies, so the surfactant is one of the last things to develop in a baby's lungs. So if a baby is born prematurely, they don't have this surfactant that allows them to be able to easily inflate their lungs. So it can be treated. They can give them a surfactant injection into the body, or the other thing that they can do is they can give cortisol, because then cortisol will stimulate the production of surfactant. But one of the risk factors of babies being born too early is that they're born before their bodies are producing surfactant, and then that makes it more difficult to inflate the lungs, because their surfactant helps to reduce the surface tension so that those lungs are able to inflate. Okay, we're back to this figure. It's a similar figure that looks at the interface between the alveoli, which is this blue part, and the blood, which is the red part. So this part of respiration is called external respiration. So the first step of respiration is called, so step 1 is called external respiration. And what happens in external respiration is that oxygen moves from the alveoli to the blood. Okay, so the oxygen is pictured here in these red, and in external respiration, the oxygen that has been picked up by breathing in air through the lungs is going to travel across the alveoli into the bloodstream. And again, remember that this layer of tissue here is simple squamous epithelial tissue, so it's very thin, and the oxygen can easily diffuse. So this happens by diffusion. The oxygen can easily diffuse across the membrane between the alveoli and the blood capillary. Once that oxygen gets into the capillary, then it gets picked up by the red blood cell. And remember, it's on the red blood cell, specifically on the hemoglobin that is in the red blood cell, that the oxygen gets transported throughout the body. And then the other thing that happens is that carbon dioxide, so the carbon dioxide is pictured in these. So remember, carbon dioxide is being carried from the body tissues in the blood, and the carbon dioxide is going to diffuse in the other direction. So it's going to leave the blood, so CO2 will go from the blood to the alveoli. And then, when you exhale, then the carbon dioxide then goes into the air and gets eliminated from the body. And again, the CO2 diffuses across this very thin, simple squamous epithelium. This figure here is showing you that so all they've done, so here's your bronchial tube, and then that keeps branching, and all these things here are the alveoli. So they've just taken one and they've kind of blown it up here. So notice that, so here's the alveoli, and first of all, notice, so there's these cells that are going to secrete surfactant within the alveoli, but then also notice that the alveoli are surrounded by these capillaries. Okay, so the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide from the blood to from the alveoli to the blood in the case of oxygen, and from the blood to the alveoli in the case of carbon dioxide, these capillary, the alveoli are surrounded by these blood capillaries, so it can happen very easily. There are a couple factors that really aid in the ability of getting oxygenated blood, and then also getting CO2 out of the body. So one is that it's simple squamous cell epithelial. So it's very, very thin. That helps the oxygen and carbon dioxide to move across. The other thing is that there is a large surface area. So when the bronchioles divide into the alveoli. I mean, there are many, many alveoli, and so there's a very large surface area of alveoli for the oxygen and carbon dioxide to move across between the blood capillaries and the alveoli. The other thing that is true is in the lungs, the capillaries are narrow. So because those capillaries are even more narrow, then usually it's easy for the oxygen molecules to find the red blood cells to attach to. You might also remember that the shape of the red blood cell. So the red blood cell is kind of shaped like a disc, and that also increases the surface area for oxygen and carbon dioxide to be able to move across between the alveoli and the capillaries. And then the other thing that's really, really important for respiration is that blood flow and ventilation or breathing are coordinated. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is like if you increase your heart rate, so if you start exercising and your heart rate increases, so that's going to increase blood flow, right? That's going to increase blood flow. But the other thing that when heart rate increases, that also stimulates the medulla oblongata, the brainstem. And guess what that does? That increases your breathing. So you can get more, so as the blood is, as you increase blood flow because you've increased the heart rate, you also increase the breathing rate. So the blood that is flowing is also able to carry more oxygen because you're breathing in more oxygen. So blood flow and ventilation are very well coordinated so that when heart rate increases, respiration is going to increase right along with it, and that improves the ability to transport oxygen throughout the body and also get rid of carbon dioxide. I think we're going to stop there. That's a lot for this week. Please keep working on, just keep plugging along in your homework, doing your study guide questions. If you have any questions about anything that was said in this lecture, you can send me an email and I'll try to answer it, and then we'll pick up and finish up the rest of Module 14 after spring break.